Well, thank you so much for this invitation and for the introduction. This is a very special and I would even say sentimental moment for me. It's actually the first talk I'm giving about this book as a finished book. And so I just wanted to thank a couple of people. Patricia Dunlap for organizing this and coordinating it, thank you, and the invitation from Tom and Jonathan Sheehan. And then, of course, my comrades in the Berkeley Russian History Study Circle, for those who do not speak the language, Kruzhok. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to discuss this work with you. It's special that it happens here, this book talk, because this is where, of course, this project was born and where I would say I was kind of formed as an historian. One of the things that people don't tell you about when you're writing a book is like the nightmares you have after you're done. And like you think you'll just have them and then you'll be done and then it'll be over. But I had this recurring nightmare, which I think I might be living right now, which was about forgetting to put people in my acknowledgements. And I'd wake up in the middle of the night, and I'd be like, oh no, I forgot this person, I have to go. And I would check my computer to make sure I put So to avoid this horrible fate, I will just say that there are a lot of people in this room to whom I owe very, very much. And they are acknowledged in the book. I believe all of them, though, who knows, ultimately. But so I just want to say and recognize what this program has been for me. Now, the starting point for me for this project was initially inspired when I was a graduate student here by an effort to make sense of what I found to be at the time two seemingly opposing and in some ways kind of distinct narratives about Soviet history. So on the one hand, scholarship underscored Soviet communism's totalitarian ambitions to transform the world and human nature. And on the other hand, the Bolsheviks themselves actually took little interest in redefining human experience beyond the political arena. Indeed, though the Soviet Communist Party had this explicitly atheist platform and aggressively persecuted religion, communism actually remained virtually absent from those areas of everyday life that before the revolution had been religion's domain. And I'm speaking here in particular of things that are in some ways the core of human experience, from births and marriages and funerals and the kind of entire world of spiritual and everyday life. So my initial interest was in how the Soviet project actually tried to enter that sphere and to transform the customary ways of life of the revolution's so-called human material by creating socialist Soviet birth, marriage, and death rituals. However, once I entered into the archives to do this research when I was making kind of my first big archival trip to Russia and Ukraine, I was surprised to find that Soviet atheists, and by this group I mean the functionaries who had been charged by the Communist Party with producing and inculcating an atheist program, were asking a lot of the same questions that I was asking in my research, which is to say, how could religion be exorcised from Soviet life? And then once it was gone, what would communism offer in its place? So I found myself in this peculiar in the archives of a very peculiar institution called the Institute of Scientific Atheism, reading hundreds of pages of transcripts of essentially atheist bureaucrats sitting in these committees, trying to ask these questions, trying to work out the communist answer to the meaning of life and death. And this really changed the scope and the focus of my research. I have to say, I mean, I know it may be hard to believe, but these transcripts were gripping. Like I would be reading them and just, would be completely consumed. And so what began in a way as the study of this fairly specific thing, this socialist ritual question, transformed into a much bigger project about the meaning of atheism for the spiritual lives of Soviet citizens, for communist ideology, and for Soviet politics. And then as it turned out, ultimately for the fate of the USSR. So in a way, I ended up writing the book that I wish someone else would have written so that I could write my book about rituals, which I think is something that kind of happens when you start out doing research. And in a way, that's kind of how you identify the gaps in scholarship, because you realize that you have questions that haven't been answered or haven't been answered adequately, and no one else seems to be answering these questions, and in fact, nobody else really seems to be asking these questions. And so I found myself kind of having to, initially starting to write what I thought was an introductory chapter to the ritual project, and then it turned into the book. So the question for me is, why had this question not been asked? Why was there no history of Soviet atheism? And first, I guess I want to just say a couple of words about the narratives that we did have about religion and atheism in the Soviet Union when I began writing this book. So there were essentially three stories that we had. The first was a kind of Cold War story that came out of the immediate post-revolutionary era. And the focus there was primarily on repression of religious institutions and believers. And I think this is the more familiar story for the mass audience. But there was little focus on atheism itself, more on the kind of anti-religious campaign. There was a second story that came out, a second kind of body of work that came out in the late Soviet period and the early post-Soviet period, and that was partly due to the fact that the archives were opened and partly due to the fact that historiography more broadly was taking the so-called cultural turn. And this work was actually interested in atheism in particular, as opposed to anti-religious work, but what it did was it focused specifically on the early Soviet period when this project was in a way most visible and most aggressive through institutions like the League of Militant Godless. So here you had a story about atheism, but it really didn't go beyond the 1930s. And moreover, these efforts of institutions like the League of Militant Godless were quite sporadic. They were the work of enthusiasts, and ultimately they were abandoned, whereas in fact what I learned was that the atheist campaign of the Khrushchev era is a much more systematic approach, and it actually creates an entire apparatus that seeks to penetrate beyond these kind of activist campaigns and into people's lives. So it's a much bigger project. Finally, there was newer work that is primarily coming out of anthropology as a discipline, and that is in conversation with emerging literature on this question of secularism in the West. And it raises interesting and important questions and proposes that we should look at the Soviet case as, in fact, not something odd and peripheral, but as a form of secularism, a form of political relationship between the religious and the political, that can be kind of mapped into a bigger global framework for understanding those things. Now, keeping in mind that the subject, Soviet atheism, is so, in some ways, visible, and Tom mentioned godless communism, it was surprising to me that there wasn't actually a full history of Soviet atheism that went from beginning to the end. And that was surprising for at least two reasons. The first, precisely because godless communism, and here I'll show an old artifact of the time, was in a ways the specter that was haunting the Western imagination throughout the 19th and especially in the 20th century, and especially so with the onset of the Cold War. And yet the study of the godless part of godless communism was relatively limited. And the second reason it was surprising is because the term atheistic communism, which was actually the term that the Pope used in an encyclical on atheistic communism in 1937, suggests that there was a relationship between atheism and communism. And yet, there were no studies that really examined the exact nature of that relationship. In fact, in my research, I found a very telling quote, which ended up for me being the epigraph of the book's introduction. It comes from somebody named Kuczynski, who then was the director of the Leningrad State Museum of the History of Religion and Atheism. And in the context in which it was said, it was a 1989 meeting of the atheist section of something called the Knowledge Society. And the Knowledge Society was the kind of biggest enlightenment organ that was supposed to disseminate atheism in the Soviet Union. Now, these professional atheists in 1989, as the star of communism is what do you say, descending, waning, they get together and they're trying to figure out what to do now and where does atheism go, and does atheism need to exist at all? And the mood was quite bleak. There was a lot of hand-wringing, but it was Kuczynski who I think really captured the crux of the issue. And he said, issues such as good and evil, conscience, justice, and retribution found a reflection in the historical mission of religion. This is why people do not grow tired of it for 1,000 years. Marxism also presented itself as a general theory of humanity, a new civilization, the image of the new man. The bid was certainly serious, but life revealed its problems. All the reproaches made about socialism and communism found their reflection in the authority and standing of atheism. Atheism was the new civilization's calling card. I found that term, that atheism was the civilization's calling card, to be very compelling, and I spent a lot of time kind of thinking about that. So in a way, my book was an effort to kind of fill the gap in our knowledge by addressing these two issues, to fill in the historical narrative, to tell the story of atheism from the revolution until the dissolution of communism. And then the second, the more complicated goal, is to make sense of this question of the relationship between atheism and communism, which is to say, what work was atheism doing for communism? Was it necessary to communism's survival? And then finally, in the last, I would say 5 to 7 years, a third question for me emerged in conversation with this anthropological work, which was this question of whether we can look at the Soviet case as a case of secularism at all, right? Are we really speaking about a secular state? Now, it may seem counterintuitive because in some ways wasn't Soviet communism kind of the secular state? And, not to kind of spoiler alert, I don't think so. This is not central to the book, but it kind of comes up in the conclusion of the book. And given this particular forum in which we're having this conversation, I'd be very happy to talk more about, the ways in which secularism and atheism do and do not actually refer to the same kinds of things. Okay, so to tell the story, to talk about the narrative, to tell the story of Soviet atheism, I decided that in the book it made more sense to start actually at the end, which is to say when atheism died. And it died actually on I would say, a very specific date and a very specific moment. On April 29th, 1988, at the height of perestroika, Gorbachev made an unanticipated decision to meet with Patriarch Pimen of the Russian Orthodox Church. And this was the first official meeting between the leader of the Soviet Communist Party and the hierarchs of the Orthodox Church since 1943, when Stalin summoned 3 Orthodox metropolitans to the Kremlin in the middle of the night to inform them that after two decades of repression, the Russian Orthodox Church could return to Soviet life with the benediction of the state. The direct impetus for Gorbachev's meeting with the Patriarch was the approaching millennium of the Christianization of Rus, an event commemorating Grand Prince Vladimir's adoption of Christianity in 988 as the official religion of Kievan Rus, which gathered his diverse lands and peoples into a unified state. And Gorbachev's motives for meeting with the Patriarch to reconsider the religious question at that particular moment in 1988 were in fact not unlike Stalin's, which is to say they were political. Just as Stalin had broken with 2 decades of anti-religious policy in order to mobilize patriotism at home and appeal to allies abroad in the midst of a catastrophic war, Gorbachev was attempting to harness orthodoxy's moral capital at home and to court political favor with Cold War adversaries to regain control over perestroika, which by early 1988 was not only losing popular support, but was also being challenged from within the Soviet political establishment by Communist Party conservatives, as well as by nationalists across the Soviet Union's titular republics, but also Russian nationalists within the center, within Russia itself. Now, in his address, here's the meeting and the pause there. In his address, Gorbachev noted that his meeting with the patriarch was taking place on the threshold of the 1000th anniversary of the introduction of Christianity in Rus. And this event, he announced, was now going to be commemorated, quote, not only in a religious but also in a socio-political tone, since it was a significant milestone in the centuries-long path of the development of the fatherland's history, culture, and Russian statehood. Now, he acknowledged what he called the deep worldview differences between the Soviet Communist Party and the Russian Orthodox Church. But he emphasized that Orthodox believers were nevertheless, and this is a quote, Soviet people, working people, patriots. And as such, they were entitled to all the rights of Soviet citizenship without restriction, including the full right to express their convictions with dignity. During the meeting, Gorbachev also called on the church to play a role in the moral regeneration of Soviet society, where universal norms, this is in his words, and customs can help our common cause. So this kind of evoking of universal norms as opposed to class morality was a huge shift in the discourse. And finally, he offered the church unprecedented concessions: the return of religious buildings and property that had been nationalized by the Bolsheviks following the revolution, permission for children's religious instruction and charity work, the elimination of restrictions on the publication of religious literature and the Bible, and the liberalization of restrictive laws that had governed Soviet religious life since the revolution. This new legal framework, which was adopted in 1990, endowed religious organizations with legal and property rights, restricted state interference in religious affairs. But what turned out to be, in my view, the most consequential, oddly, revision was this new prohibition on the Soviet state's funding of atheism, a provision that effectively ended this long marriage between communism and atheism in the Soviet Union. So Gorbachev's meeting with the patriarch transformed the Russian Orthodox millennium from what it had been, which was a narrowly religious event that was not supposed to concern anybody but the believers, the Orthodox believers in the country, into a national celebration that was sanctioned by the Soviet state. And this dramatic and very unexpected shift in the Soviet position on religion turned out to be consequential and raises a number of questions. Why, for example, did Soviet communism abandon its commitment to atheism? Was there a relationship between those two divorces, the divorce of communism and atheism on the one hand, and the divorce of the Soviet state from the Communist Party, which ultimately ended the Soviet project? So I want to turn now to kind of return to the beginning, right? So that was the end. And I want to turn to the question of what the Bolsheviks thought they were doing when they embarked on this campaign. So the Bolsheviks imagined communism, of course, as a world without religion, and the Soviet experiment was really the first attempt to turn their vision into reality. As faithful Marxist-Leninists, the Bolsheviks did not anticipate religion to be a serious problem or a serious obstacle to their project of revolutionary transformation. They understood that seizing political power would not immediately transform society, but they had faith in the bigger Marxist model of historical development, according to which religion would inevitably just kind of go away, wither away. Of course, what became clear after the revolution was that religion was not going to die a natural death. The unfolding of history would require the active involvement of the party itself. And the Bolsheviks, in trying to think about what kind of involvement this would require of them, understood religion as essentially three kinds of things. The first consisted of the political, which was grounded in religious institutions, the second in its ideological claims, which were embodied in false worldviews and based on the belief in the supernatural and the transcendent. And the third was what they thought of as the spiritual realm, which encompassed the values and practices and customs and rituals that made up this kind of ineffable dimension of everyday life. And the party's engagements with religion reflected, in effect, those three understandings. To address religion as a political phenomenon, the party deployed militant anti-clerical approach that used administrative regulation and political repression to, in effect, try to circumscribe the autonomy of religious institutions. The goal of that was to marginalize religion in public life and in order to undermine its political power. To address religion as an ideological problem, the party relied on propaganda, education, and enlightenment in order to inculcate what they believed would ultimately marginalize religious belief, which is to say science, inculcate science and enlightenment. And finally, to address religion as a spiritual problem, the party used the tools of cultural revolution to transform traditional ways of life into the communist way of life. So to analyze the process through which the party actually went about this, and in the way that they produced, contested, and revised the atheist project, the book is kind of organized around those three sets of oppositions. The political opposition, which was between the party's commitment to ideological purity on the one hand, and the state's pursuit of effective governance, and those two things did not always go together very well. Then the ideological opposition, on the one hand, between religion, superstition, and backwardness, and on the other, science, reason, and progress. And then finally, the spiritual opposition between indifference and emptiness on the one hand, and spiritual fullness and conviction on the other. And I think these three oppositions can be seen as a set of problems that the party, that the Soviet project had to solve if it was going to succeed at building this new world that they set out to build. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those three things in order to give a sense of how this progressed. And I also want to just kind of note that they progressed chronologically in a way that reflects the kind of priorities that the party invested in each. So they start with the political. Let me get to... Something happened to the screen. Oh, okay, right. There we are. It was the wheel. I don't know what that means. It's just, the pinwheel. It's fine. All right. Well, these are three familiar figures, right? And they embodied the kind of the political opposition. It focused, this question, the political opposition, forced the party to answer the question of what kind of state Soviet communism should produce. And as the oscillations between ideological and pragmatic commitments throughout Soviet history show, this question actually was never answered definitively. One of the reasons why this project is so unstable is because they're constantly trying to navigate between pursuing their ideological goals and also pursuing political stability, which the two of them do not always go hand in hand. And with regard to religion in particular, Stalin provisionally reconciled this opposition in 1943 when he instituted this rapprochement with religious institutions and made a compromise of ideological purity for the sake of political security and social mobilization during the war. So in the book, what I do is I trace how the Bolsheviks approach religion under Lenin and Stalin, and how and I talk about the ways in which they use legal and administrative regulation, terror and repression, and militant atheist propaganda in the early Soviet period. Now, against the background of the Bolsheviks' claims to be building a new world, remaking society, and transforming human nature, religion remained in the early Soviet period always a political problem, a tool that could be used by the enemy to undermine the revolution at home. While in theory they considered militant atheism an important weapon on the religious front, in practice, it consistently remained secondary to these other objectives: political consolidation, economic modernization, and social stability. So religion mattered to the Bolsheviks, I think, in the early period, inasmuch as it constituted a threat to Soviet power. And by the end of the 1930s, with the political power of the Orthodox Church as an institution basically destroyed, they believed that the threat had been effectively neutralized. So from this point, the continued existence of religion in the Soviet Union would only be on the state's terms. Stalin set those terms in 1943, when he invited the church back into Soviet life. And he created a government bureaucracy to manage religious affairs that formalized this new framework for Soviet engagements with religion, and that in effect remained in place until the Soviet collapse. And in fact, Stalin's last decade in power was a period of relative stability on the religious front. And what's so interesting to me, and this kind of connects to the new project about the Cold War, is just at that moment when you have this Cold War mobilization against godless communism in the West, right, in the early Cold War period, is the period in which nothing is happening with atheism at home in the Soviet Union. So the period from 45 to 53, the atheists inside the Soviet Union are saying, you know, we've been abandoned, nobody cares about us, look, all the priests are just walking around and, you know, nobody's saying anything. There's this great moment when, you know, the kind of godfather of atheists, Bolshevik, writes this, you know, letter, and he says, you know, I go to Leningrad and, you know, they're restoring all these churches and, you know, what does it mean to be a Bolshevik anymore, right? So this is the kind of what's happening inside the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, right? Meanwhile, in the West, there's this kind of like the godless communists are coming. So that to me is a real interesting disconnect between perception and fact that I think is worth investigating. But I think for the point for the story of what's happening inside, the big point here is that Stalin's last decade in power was a period of relative stability on the religious front, whereas the decline of political support for atheism made it practically invisible in public life. And this takes us to the second opposition, which is the ideological opposition between religion and science, which I think highlights the party's effort to answer the question of what kind of society Soviet communism should produce. And it dominated the debates of the Khrushchev era. Whereas building socialism under Stalin was above all a political project to create the economic infrastructure and social cohesion of a modern socialist state, building communism under Khrushchev was an ideological project that sought to produce what he envisioned as a rational, harmonious, and morally disciplined communist society. Within this framework, religion, which had been kind of passively tolerated over the course of the late Stalin era, again became a problem, although the nature of the problem had now changed. Whereas before it was a political problem, now it was marked explicitly as an ideological problem. So when you went and you started closing churches or you said something negative about the clergy, it wasn't because they are your enemies living within Soviet borders, because the church was now patriotic and the believers were now patriotic Soviet citizens. It was because they had bad beliefs. And so you had to exercise those bad beliefs to save those Soviet citizens who were still victims of their own backwardness. Now, to tell this part of the story, I kind of follow this effort to remake the world in what you can kind of see as the revolution's second act, which is Khrushchev's kind of revival of communism following Stalin's death. And here the issue is that since religion remained a fact of Soviet life, and since Khrushchev, a true communist, believed religion and communism were fundamentally incompatible, atheism had to return to do some of that work of bringing about the kind of society he envisioned for the communist future. So under Khrushchev, actually, the party mobilized the most extensive anti-religious campaign in Soviet history. It closed nearly half of the country's religious spaces. Now, I should say, I didn't throw in numbers here, but just for clarity, by the end of the 1930s, there were about 1,000 open, functioning churches on the territory of the Soviet Union. So most churches had been closed. after Stalin's rapprochement with the church, they start opening churches so that by the time Khrushchev comes to power, there are about 14,000, right? So they've opened, more than 12,000 churches in a period of a decade. And then Khrushchev reinitiates this campaign and closes about half of those. So now we're back down to about 7,500. So Khrushchev closes nearly half of the country's religious spaces. They institute very repressive constraints on religious organizations and clergy, largely through things like taxation. And they invest unprecedented resources into creating the centralized atheist apparatus that could actually reach the masses, right? So that could go deeper into Soviet society. At the same time, Soviet atheism itself was redefined. As I said, since religious institutions were patriotic and atheism now had to be about enlightenment, it was no longer a militant atheism, but a scientific atheism, so that the terminology itself shifted. Now, what does a scientific atheism look like? I can't see this super well, unfortunately, but so I will narrate for you. Scientific atheism is a cosmonaut in space who flies to space and he tells you that he did not see God there. Okay? Says there is no God, because I've been there. Okay? And this was a kind of trope of scientific atheism. There's another one where God is on his cloud with the cupids and angels, and here there's a priest on the, maybe you could keep it off just for a little bit. Thank you. There's a priest and he's trying to call God on the telephone, but the rockets, the Sputniks, and the rocket ships have broken the connection, and so the poster is called "The Connection is Broken," right? So this is kind of technology and science triumphing over backwardness and religion. And then in practice, this continued, how do you bring this to the people besides posters? Well, you do lectures at the planetarium and you tell them about, technological achievements and the way the world works and the way nature works. So here you have, children at the Moscow planetarium listening to the feats of the cosmonauts. And of course, not all of the Soviet citizens can come to Moscow to go to the Moscow planetarium. So you bring the planetarium to them. And this is a planetarium bus that would go out to the collective farms with a telescope, and it would do these lectures, enlightenment lectures, and they would organize a dance and let you look through the telescope and tell you about, why you shouldn't celebrate Easter and things like this, right? I mean, this is like these things actually went together. And so, okay, so you kind of have multiple chapters in the book on this. The question is, did it work? The answer is no. And not only that, but the atheists themselves knew it didn't work, and they were kind of constantly caricaturing themselves and thinking about, okay, scientific atheism is not actually achieving the intended goal. So here, they would talk about, okay, here's the atheist lecturer, and God's in the audience, and the lecture's title is, Does God Exist, right? So things like this. Or, this one is actually my favorite, there's an atheist lecturer who looks like, your typical bureaucrat with his notes falling out of his little briefcase. And he says, why are you taking me to heaven? And they say, for bad atheist lectures, right? because the argument is that these efforts were in fact so bad that they were actually working for religion as opposed to achieving atheist goals, right? Okay, so this is kind of where they find themselves at the end of the Khrushchev era, and they're aware that it makes there's only so much that you can do if you just keep building planetariums across the country, right? And so they have to shift gears, and here the conversation becomes about spiritual problems and spiritual questions between what they see as a kind of indifference and conviction. And this, I think, reflects this final frontier, which was the party's effort to define what kind of person Soviet communism should produce. And of course, this question haunted the Soviet project from its inception, but it really became the central preoccupation of the late Soviet period. In the Brezhnev era, this continued failure of religion to die out, even after the party's best efforts to hurry this process along, forced atheists to confront the really complex reality of lived religion and to reconsider their own definitions of religion and their own approaches to atheist work. So the atheist apparatus had to recognize that even if in theory communism embraced human life from the cradle to the grave, what this meant in practice, that is to say in Soviet lived experience, still really hadn't been addressed. So in the late Soviet period, atheists increasingly come to see religion not just as a political or an ideological phenomenon, but also as a spiritual one, and a spiritual problem perhaps more importantly than the political and ideological. This lived religion, which they saw as deeply embedded in people's worldviews and ways of life, could be overcome only with a spiritual atheism. And that spiritual atheism had to address not just institutions and beliefs, but things like morality and emotion and aesthetics and rituals and community experience. So Soviet atheists became aware that the sacred space that they had fought so hard to liberate over the course of the first 5 decades of the Soviet communist project, rather than becoming atheist, just was empty. Right? So they hadn't filled it with anything else. And how to fill that space with what they now came to describe as atheist conviction was the fundamental question facing the atheist apparatus for the rest of the Soviet period. Now, why does something like the indifference actually matter in this case, right? What do they care if Soviet people are indifferent to religious questions? And they cared because the indifference was predominantly a phenomenon of the youth. And what they were realizing was that they were failing to reproduce their own values over to the next generation. And so the future of communism, they're saying the church is able to kind of recapture the youth and kind of reproduce religious beliefs and religious practices over time. And our youth, instead, who knows what they believe? This is their kind of, and so what comes out in the Brezhnev era is this trope of what they call the indifferent young person. And the indifferent young person, how do you know they're indifferent? Well, because they have no firm ideological position on these questions. And here you have an example where it says, people without principles also have principles. This is a young man, you see he's supposed to be a Komsomol boy, a member of the Communist Youth League, but he's getting married in a church. And he says, and this poster says, those without principles also have principles. When it's convenient, they go to church, and when it's convenient, they don't. Right? So this kind of idea that what they called Soviet young people, this problem of what they called spiritual consumerism, right? This idea that you could just kind of go here and go there, and you actually had no position at all. You just did whatever was, nice for you in that moment. So over the course of the late Soviet period, the atheist apparatus learned that in order to bring about a world without religion, it was not enough to exercise religion from the center of political, social, and cultural life. It was necessary to fill this sacred space with positive meaning. So in a way, I think atheism was a mirror that reflected communism back to itself by forcing it to contend with the significance of religion over the course of its own historical development. So I think to say a couple of words by way of conclusion, I think for Soviet communism, ultimately religion represented above all an obstacle to its monopoly on political, ideological, and spiritual authority. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, what they promised was to liberate the people from the old world, to overcome exploitation with justice, conflict with harmony, superstition with reason, and religion with atheism. And as they set out to build this new world, they rejected all previous sources of authority, replacing the autocratic state with Soviet power, religious morality with class morality, backwardness and superstition with an enlightened, rational, and modern way of life. And they sought to remove religion in all of these different spheres by renouncing traditional religious institutions, theologies, and ways of life, and offering in their place the Communist Party and Marxism-Leninism, a party that claimed to have a monopoly on power and truth, and an ideology that promised to give people new meaning in both collective and individual life. But despite the secularization of the state and the party's continued commitment to atheism, this vision of radical transformation through cultural revolution and several anti-religious campaigns and atheist campaigns, Soviet communism never actually managed to overcome religion or to produce an atheist society. In fact, as Gorbachev's ultimate reversal on this question makes clear, religion remained a problem for the Soviet project until the end, and it was a problem that atheism was unable to solve. So, to return to the millennium, in June 1988, the Orthodox millennium was publicly celebrated in Moscow, with celebrations continuing through the month of June across the USSR. And the millennium celebrations had all the symbolic trappings of political patronage, with a number of the events taking place in important Soviet institutions, including the Bolshoi Theater, and attended by prominent officials and public figures, including Andrei Gromyko, and who was the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, people from the party apparatus, right? So and including Gorbachev's own wife, Raisa, right? So there was kind of prominent state figures taking part in a religious event. In fact, Konstantin Kharchev, who was the chair of the committee that monitored religious life, even secured a ZIL limousine, which is a mode of transportation that was reserved only for the political elite, to transport the patriarch around Moscow to the celebration events. And this wasn't a simple thing. This was a signal that indicated that that this entire event had been sanctioned and that the party itself had adopted a new course. The millennium was also widely covered in the press and on television, to the great surprise of the Soviet audience, who were accustomed to seeing religion depicted as a world of backward old women and fanatical sectarians. So, for the first time since the October Revolution, religion was cast as a legitimate part of the country's past, and perhaps more importantly, a normal part of its present. I think that the sanctioning of religion was, in fact, incredibly meaningful politically and very consequential. Reflecting back on that year, the writer Anatoly Strelyansky remarked, "There came a moment when the number one Soviet poet, Andrei Voznesensky, and the number one Soviet singer, Alla Pugacheva, understood that they could wear a cross around their neck and nothing would happen to them because of it." In the words of one contemporary observer, religion returned to public life not through the service, this is a quote, not through the service entrance, but through the front door. The sanctioned return of religion to public life bolstered the moral authority of the state, but it fundamentally undermined the legitimacy of the Communist Party, which found itself increasingly marginal to the emerging ideological and political landscape. So Soviet communism's break with atheism in favor of universal values and ideological pluralism signaled the end of the party's monopoly on truth, its ideological coherence, and thus its moral authority and political legitimacy. The Communist Party gave up the faith and became simply a political party, no longer seeking to make windows into people's souls. End.
Questions. Maybe people could introduce themselves because people from different communities here, different academic communities. Sorry.
I'm Joey. I'm a historian of the Soviet Union and in particular of the collapse in this period. And so I'm also interested in the religious question at that time. And it seems to me that your use of the word religion and this sense of a return of religion obscures the fact that it's from the perspective of the average person, it's a completely different sort of religion we're talking about. And so there are polls and statistics that suggest that at this period, many people call themselves Orthodox, but it's not really tied to any practices. They don't know anything about the doctrine. All of that, and the institution and the so the theological points are lost. And so from one perspective, then the atheist project is very successful in damaging religion. And so how do you, to what extent is there a connection between the beginning and the end of the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important part of the story, and it kind of gets at this question of secularization versus atheism. I think the secularization project succeeded. To what degree atheism was the instrument and the vehicle through which secularization happened, I actually don't think it was the primary one. I think there were other factors that were happening across the world, urbanization, industrialization, that actually affected this much more than any kind of Enlightenment propaganda or campaigns. So I think that's kind of one part of it, is to say that, yes, of course, there was a kind of a transformation of religiosity, and if anything, it was indifference, right? That's the kind of outcome of secularization. But the atheist part, I think, is important, at least for me, as a political symbol and a political kind of tool for the party to be able to consistently kind of buttress its moral authority. So I think it's politically significant, even though socially you could say it was never significant. In fact, when I was researching, when I started doing my research, one of the kind of constant questions or constant responses I got, people say, "Oh, what are you working on?" And I'd say atheism, and people say, like, "Who cared about that? Nobody was listening." But then, right, like nobody actually listened to this stuff. Like even the atheists knew nobody listened. But that suggests, right, that we as historians, right, should care about the things that the state cared about. Right, and I'm saying, like, maybe the state should have cared more about this if they really wanted to succeed. I think there was a kind of myopic attitude that just because they thought it wasn't important doesn't mean it actually wasn't important. I guess is what I'm saying.
So
John Conway history.
There are a lot of definitions of religion. I'll suggest one, which is faith in things not seen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I mean, that's objectionable, but potentially a kind of foundation, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking the 1940s. I'm thinking of the period in which the communist parties are illegal in much of Europe, and in fact they're hunted in Germany. And when the Gestapo would locate and pick up communist functionaries, what they always talked about is that under torture, communists would not confess. That they seem to be people more deeply imbued with conviction and belief than any Nazi, or than any Christian. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of faith present in these communists that is extraordinary, and has caused people to refer to communism as a kind of religious, political religion or religious belief, right?
Sure.
And it gives all the things that one would expect of Christianity, including a sense of meaning, a sense of values, probably a series of rituals. It's a religion in a serious form, arguably, right? But what you were saying is that still the sacred space is vacant. Well, it wasn't vacant for those people. It was very full. People were willing to be tortured to death, clearly had ultimate kind of beliefs. And so I'm wondering, how does your story relate to that kind of story? I mean, does that simply disappear? Does it become a matter of routine in the post-war period? Yeah. Because clearly something is present that is not, that you have to.
Yeah. Well, this is what makes this story so complicated, because if you define religion in that way, and this is kind of, in a way, like, how do you connect, like, Yuri's story, right, like Yuri Snowskin's people to these people? And I guess my answer to that is that these people who believed, the party members, the communists who would not confess under torture, they weren't the problem. They had the conviction, And they were always present, but they were always a minority, and actually very small minority. Now, the objective of the Soviet project was not to have a small minority of convinced communists and a great society of indifferent people. So what they were trying, the way that they envisioned that this would work was that eventually the Soviet Union would just become the Communist Party writ large, that everybody would be one of these convinced communists. And this was where they ran into a wall, is that they weren't able to actually push this beyond a certain level. And they weren't able to create a society of people who would not subvert or go against communist ideals when it suited them. And this was what was so infuriating to them, is that they themselves, the people who are kind of doing this work, are those, model citizens, model communists, and they can't manage to affect that kind of transformation among the masses. I think the most telling story, in a way, because you're in this kind of question of atheism and religion, is this incident that happens where an atheist gets sent to a village to do atheist propaganda, and then he tells a story of what happens, and he says, this is in the context of saying that we're failing, right? So he goes, so I go into this hut. I've been told that there are believers in this hut, and they don't know I'm an atheist. They just think I'm just, visiting, and I'm just, having a talk with them. And I see this guy, and he's playing cards under the icon in the corner. And I say to him, why are you playing cards under the icon in the corner? Don't you know that's, blasphemy? And the guy kind of looks at him, and he says, well, the icons don't mind. So he says to the guy, well, if, okay, he says, I tried a different approach. And I say, well, but don't you know that the priests are, parasites, and, that you pay them money to do these rituals? And he says, and the guy says to him, well, yeah, of course I know that. I hope they choke on the money. I'm still going to baptize my kid. And then the guy says to the atheist, he said, well, were you baptized? And of course he had been, right? So he said, yeah. And he goes, all of Russia was baptized, and look at it. And so there's this whole kind of conversation that happens. And I thought, at the time I was like, how is this conversation? Why does this atheist care if this guy is not being a good Christian, right? Like this is the whole irony. He is religious, right? He's saying your behavior does not line up with your professed faith. And so in a way, like, for them to have made atheists, they would have first had to make Christians, right? And actually create people who had a kind of disciplined theology, and then say, and actually you're wrong, right? So I think it's an issue of scale rather than type. And for the political project to work as they envisioned it, you would have had to have scale. You couldn't just have, and then that's where they find themselves at the end. They're like, we're sectarians. That's what they call themselves. They're like, we're the sectarians. Everybody else is normal, and now we're the weirdos, right? So,
back here, would you?
Hi, Jonathan Harris, alumnus in the history department, and I appreciated the different ways one can think about space, both inside, ideologically, but I also wondered if your research brought you at all to the physical space, control of the church's property, and so forth, because, perhaps shortly after the revolution, in places like Spain, where when the revolution got in, they took over those churches, and they were using them for other purposes, and that kind of stalled, of course, there. But anyway, since it cycled through an entire revolution back to the church prelates taking power again, whether early on or towards that transition back to a place in the society, was there anything interesting about the property and stuff?
There was, and the reason I'm messing with this is because it just crashed on me, and I want to show you something. There was. So of course they took over churches, and they they made them into clubs and so on, and swimming pools, and storage facilities, and all sorts of things. Why is this not working? Is there a way to make it work? Yeah, if you could, like, I don't know how to make anything work, unfortunately. So, but yeah, I mean, they were very much also interested in physical space. But the question is, what could they produce to create the kinds of emotions and aesthetic experiences that people experienced in the space of a church. So there were efforts to do this, and I can speak. There we go. Oops. Oh.
Do you want to find it?
Oh yeah,
It's
sure.
so bad. Sorry.
Yeah, and so, all right, let me try one more time, and then I'll abandon this foolish quest. All right.
Did you say witchcraft?
Go to slide.
Witchcraft. It is also witchcraft. It is also very much witchcraft. Okay, so how do I
Go to slideshow.
go to slideshow? Okay, is that going to give us the full picture?
Current slide.
Current slide. From current slide. And okay. So I think that I'll just kind of give you a palimpsest of this space problem, right? This is the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. Was the kind of the centerpiece of patriotic Russian Orthodox Christianity. In 1931, it's blown up by Stalin. And it's blown up in order to put in its place something even greater and more compelling than this cathedral, which is the Palace of Soviets. The Palace of Soviets was supposed to occupy the center of Moscow. The Palace of Soviets never got made for a number of reasons, but primary one being that the materials that they were going to make it with were used for the war. And instead, what went in its place was a big swimming pool. Okay, so this is what occupied the center of Moscow from 1960 until the late 1980s. And then there was this prescient cartoonist in 1988 who did this image of there you have the diving boards and swimming pools, and beneath you have the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, right, kind of in the reflection. And lo and behold, it got remade exactly as it had been in its place, right? And in fact, here's a Metropolitan Ilarion, who's a very prominent figure in the Orthodox Church, and this is kind of the centerpiece of Russian state kind of orthodoxy. It's where the Pussy Riot girls did their, so like the space, there was this engagement with space, but it was very ad hoc. It never actually managed to achieve the kind of grandeur and aesthetic success that they had been striving for. And the question is, was it because that was just a foolish quest to begin with, or was it because there weren't enough resources allocated, or who knows, right? It wasn't a high enough priority. They didn't think it was that important. I don't, it's hard to weigh those things.
Some hand here. Yeah, and then you, sir. Right. Please. You are?
I'm Kayla Stoller, and I'm one of Victoria's former students at Wesleyan.
Ah.
So I have a question about your research.
You followed all the way here?
Yeah, so my question is about your research, and I'm wondering, so you kind of are in a unique position in that you're traveling to Russia and Ukraine to look through archives, and most of your primary sources are going to be obviously from those places.
Right.
And then I'm assuming you're also you're reading secondary sources from Western scholars, and occasionally probably primary sources from Western newspapers or whatever about the events of the millennium. And so my question is how difficult is it to parse apart the Western perception of what Soviet atheism is and what it actually was?
Yeah.
Was it really easy as a researcher to determine, okay, this is the Western bias playing in, and here's what it actually was, or was it more difficult to discern?
I think because I did all of the internal atheist research first, and so I had a very clear picture of, having read through hundreds of pages of transcripts of atheists wringing their hands about their failures. When I would see newspaper coverage, Western newspaper coverage, saying, this is coming for us, it would just become very clear that this was a kind of a figment of the Western imagination. But on the other hand, I would say that there were there were things that are very telling. So, for example, when the millennium happened, the Western press completely did not see it coming. And that's really interesting to me, because they were so committed to the narrative that there was this kind of like, we didn't anticipate that they would actually celebrate this on this scale and in this way. And, what does it mean? And does this mean a turn and direction? And, so that I think is very indicative of the narrative that they had been operating on before that. So I would say that's kind of how those two things connect.
Sure.
Do the Michael Mautner, I'm an alumnus and a clergyman in Oakland. Do the anthropological sources that you were interacting with make a distinction between religion and established religion? Because they do. Because it seems to me that, at least from this and the end of the story, it's more a matter of what was Russia and what is Russia.
Yeah.
And orthodoxy in Russia can't be severed. They made a real big attempt to do so. Does that sound like something that's part of your thesis? Or?
Well, I mean, they clearly made, for them, the kind of what you called established religion is the political side of it, right? They say, that's the church, they're in power, right? This is an institution that can do things, right? The lived kind of religion, which I think is what you mean by religion, right? As opposed to established religion, or, people's lives and their practices and their beliefs, that to them was a kind of a separate category and had to have different tools in order to engage with that side of things. But I think, ultimately, I think that, I didn't go into this, I really wanted to write a kind of cultural history. And like I said, I was really interested in the rituals and that part of it. And then I ended up writing what, in effect, was a political history. Because ultimately, I think the problem, to some degree, was that they always, in all moments, prioritized the political. And even when they were thinking about other stuff, the political questions continued to be primary. So, now in 2016, I believe, in 2016, there was a statue to Grand Prince Vladimir, right, that was put up in the middle of Moscow, right? And that's a huge testament, right? And then this documentary that came out in 2013 was called The Second Baptism of Rus, right? So this became the kind of central narrative, and it was very much a national one, and it's about what does it mean to be Russia, and it kind of stepped in to fill the vacuum that was left behind by the entire communist edifice. So they've kind of, in a way, that began before the communist project even ended, right? This kind of alternative narrative of Russian Orthodoxy and the kind of great civilization that entails.
Okay.
Regarding the transformation of churches into storage houses, clubs, and so on, something similar happened with monasteries. Monasteries were also transformed in that kind of way. There was one monastery that became a penal colony.
Right, yeah.
And most, at least Moscow monasteries had, or all of Moscow monasteries had cemeteries. It's something I'm interested in right now. And as far as death rituals go, you started your talk by saying that the Soviets didn't really produce new kinds of birth, etc., and death rituals. And one of the ways that they handled death was, or death in the Russian Orthodox sense, or in any religious sense, was to literally raise cemeteries, monastery cemeteries at monasteries. And at those which remained, they of course cut off all the Orthodox crosses, etc. I mean, there was a lot of that kind of activity. And what is interesting is that the bas-reliefs in the Christ the Savior are now located in Donskoy, at a cemetery, etc.
Right.
So there was all of this exchange going on. And many of the monasteries became museums. So it was also, and this happened in the late 20s, so it's not like Khrushchev time. But, so the idea of history, or the preservation of history, which of course included Orthodox history, was also remained important. And of course, Donskoy Monastery, Novodevichy Monastery, there were several. They were called anti-religious museums. So there was this curious kind of ambiguity. On the one hand, destroy completely, on the other hand, save. On the one hand, take these fancy gravestones from one monastery to the Donskoy, which was essentially preserved, and stack them there for whatever, for when, etc. So, so I'm curious about the ambiguous dimensions of, of the anti-religious campaigns.
Sure. Well, I think that there's been a couple of really interesting works that have come out in the last couple of years that deal with this issue of museumification of religion, especially in starting in the 60s, when the kind of movement for historical preservation becomes a kind of mobilizing social kind of civic group, right? There's this kind of story starts with with Likhachev and this kind of attempt to kind of preserve. And so there's kind of two sides to that. On the one hand,
I was talking about the 20s and 30s.
Right. Well, I mean, it's all kind of part and parcel of saying, okay, this is no longer a living thing. This is now a museum, right? This is an artifact. And that's recodifying, I think, these things in a really powerful way. But I think you're absolutely right, because it's still in doing this and in creating a kind of cultural aura, right? This is culturally significant to us. It keeps them in Soviet life as important things, right? So they didn't just destroy, they kind of recoded and then, left them there, and then all sorts of interesting things start happening to those artifacts, I think, in the late Soviet period.
So gave permission, so to speak, right, to the believers to see all this.
Sure. It certainly kept them visible, which I think is very important.
Sure.
As Obolowski, alumnus and also geography at Lonely College. I'm also wondering if rational atheism was such a failure. I'm certainly a product of it. And we went to St. Peter, Leningrad, that Museum of Atheism and Religion. And I know a lot of people who would just completely ignore in school, Soviet propaganda, political propaganda, but they were listening to presentations there, torture instruments of religion, fanatical adherence to religion, hermits, all these extreme cases of religious fanaticism. This was all very convincing. And what I'm also, to some, I'm not saying, but I think certain segments of Soviet population were transformed. And it wasn't such a failure. I'll give you just one example. Soviet Jews, they became disappointed with communism and Bolshevism, but they didn't come back to religion, even though en masse. They But then they went back to other parts of the world, and they have embraced maybe tradition, but not religion. They never went back to religion. There's a certain rational atheism that prevents a lot of people from going back to religion. So I wouldn't say it's a complete failure.
I think that we're not really in disagreement, because what I'm really saying is it failed as a political project. Not that it failed in having an impact on Soviet society. I think it did. But I think as a political project, which was really the ambition, was for people to stop behaving in certain ways, to stop baptizing their kids. So, for example, why does it matter to the party if somebody who is not a believer baptizes their child? Like, kind of, if you think about it rationally, like, why do they care? And yet they consistently bring this up as a problem. The Komsomol kids are baptizing their kids. We have to figure out how to get them to stop baptizing their kids. So they continue to engage with this as something that's politically significant, because they believe that they are losing this next generation of people, and that this is a marker for them that there's a distance that they're failing to bridge. So I'm not saying that, none of this made any impact. I think education made a huge impact, right? The people were much more educated. But I don't think that wasn't what they were after. And this is kind of the secularism, atheism issue that I was kind of raising initially. If it was about what you're talking about is secularism, right? Some people are atheists and they believe this, some people don't, right? But that's a kind of a secular structure in which there is the possibility of belief or unbelief. But that's not what they were after, right? If they were after that, then all these indifferent young people would have never been a problem. They would have never even been on their radar. What they were after was a conversion process, right? They were after a kind of mass conversion of Soviet people. So let's say you would have succeeded in kind of satisfying them, but they wanted everyone to, right?
The Soviet project failed, but the communist project may not have failed because North Korea and China and religiosity is so, there's atheism is at high level.
Well, but in China, it's religion's coming back in a huge way. So I don't know.
What if I could ask you a question that connects John's question and this one? So there was a time when you were working on your dissertation, where you were interested in, I think it was a Brezhnev project, to go out and study religion. It speaks to the project here on public theology. That Brezhnev sort of had a program in public theology, which is to say, at least study of what people thought going. And back in the day, you were interested in how their effort that they did this in order to try to create rituals which were going to fill this empty space. So what's interesting to me is that you speak. It's never an empty space, but everything you told us about is negative. Now, John's question is that the communists had beliefs. They didn't, as far as at least from remember your thesis, have rituals.
They did have rituals, but they didn't have. They had.
But so what we're saying is other revolutionary moves actually tried to fill the empty space. So the French revolutionaries created a different cult, and they tried to do all this sort of stuff. The Nazis at least try to have different sort of these religious burial practices, have a more I won't say atavistic, but of a less Christian sort. So I just wonder what happened to the part of your project of where the Soviet
it's still there. It's still there.
Actually fill these spaces with an alternative for the whole period, for the Brezhnev period.
Right.
So it seems to have dropped out of your work.
Well, it's dropped out of the talk just for the point of the scale of the thing. But just quickly, there was this, as you call it, public theology, but there was this mass mobilization to understand the place of religion in public life. And they would send out sociologists to study this. So this is how they learned all the things that I've kind of now told you, right? Which is that people are doing this, but they believe this, right? This is all coming from their own sociologists. And they did, from the beginning, think about the ritual problem. And they, with the model of the French Revolution in mind, it's just that the best way I can characterize it quickly is that they were just constantly getting distracted by things that were more important, right? So, we need to come up with this, but there's the Nazis are coming. Are we really going to sit here and this was kind of like, they're like, are we really going to sit here and work on red weddings and but this is kind of the perennial thing. Is like, at what point will it become the most important thing? And it did actually become the most important thing, or as important as it was ever going to become in the late 60s and 70s. And so I do have a chapter in the book that's about just the ritual project. And something I'm working on now is why that didn't ultimately come to fruition. But they did actually succeed with weddings. Weddings, people still get married according to the Soviet ritual, which they don't even really know is the Soviet ritual. They kind of think that it's always been there, even though it really started in the 60s. So, but then they didn't succeed with the baptism alternative, and they definitely didn't with the funeral either. So it's interesting, why succeed with one but not with others. So we can kind of hypothesize. But.
Victoria, and then.
I just wanted to ask you initially when you started giving your talk, you said, as the spoiler moment, that you think that secularization is not the way to describe the Soviet period.
Secularism.
Could you give us a definition of secularization and explain how it might pertain to the 20th century?
Well, there are many people who have, many have been called to give such definitions. but I think, the most straightforward one to me is that, when people speak about secularization, they're really describing a kind of social process, not a political project. They're talking about what's happening in society and to the place of religion vis-a-vis various kind of public and private spheres. Secularism is a kind of political project that tries to affect the institutional arrangements and the kind of boundaries between the public and the private in a way that requires much more intervention and regulation. So when people talk about secularization, there usually isn't a kind of clear agent that's doing it, other than industrialization, urbanization, right? There's a kind of process in place. When people talk about secularism, usually it's in the context of something much more assertive. So, in the French case or in Turkey, right? Something that was envisioned as a program with a certain political objective in mind, which is separate church and state. So I think, ultimately where I come down is that, you can see secularization in the Soviet Union the same way you can see it almost everywhere else in Europe and, and in that part of the world because of the same processes. But there isn't secularism because secularism would have been okay with indifference, and it would have also been okay with pluralism. And as soon as they introduce pluralism into the system, the whole thing falls apart. So it was incapable of actually accommodating that either ideologically or politically. So to me, when you talk about secularism, you're really describing something where people are just supposed to stay out of politics and public life with their kind of convictions. But here, that wasn't enough. They needed to enter politics and public life with a very specific set of convictions. And I think that, to me, never actually transpired. So that, to me, says much more a kind of conversion experience than a kind of secularism framework.
Matt.
My name is Aurora, and I'm an undergrad at Berkeley. I'm currently doing a thesis on the Russian Orthodox Church in Britain and
great.
Domestic violence is sort of decriminalized. But my question is, when the Soviet Union was repressing religion, how exactly did the state embody or maintain moral authority? So what were the traditional values, and were there any traditional values that they attempted to maintain?
Traditional values. Can you clarify? You mean traditional values on the side of the party?
Yeah, because you talked about this idea of having popular support or maintaining this kind of unity or having this kind of moral authority.
Yeah.
Right. So how exactly did that play out? I guess in terms of unifying people under the same set of values, or the same set of morality.
Right. Well, I think the clearest example of this was under Khrushchev, when they issued the so-called moral code of the builder of communism, right? And the moral code of the builder of communism was precisely that kind of project. Let's codify what it means to be a communist as a set of values that were actually number one, collectivism, number two, right? So, you can't really argue with the moral code of the builders of communism. So there's nothing on there that's that would contravene most normal human behavior, right? Of being, kind to your comrades and so on. So the fact that they felt the need to actually make this explicit, I think, is interesting. And the other thing is, in that documentary which is called, this is apropos your interest in Putin's Russia, in the documentary that's called The Second Baptism of Rus, they interview Putin, and he says, well, look, basically, what was the moral code of the builders of communism? It was, a moral framework. And, in fact, there's a continuity. So he tries to actually erase the entire project of Soviet communism, which was to create something different than the traditional values, right? So he says, well, look, the moral code is essentially the same thing as Christian morality. Look at it. So I think this story is constantly being rewritten for various political ends, but I think if you want the answer to your question, look back to the moral code, because I think that's where the kind of continuity is.
I have a short one.
Okay, one last short question.
Does your title come from a poem? It sounds familiar.
Thank you for asking that. Yeah, it's a proverb. So there was a moment when a Soviet writer was attending one of these party meetings to talk about atheism failing, and he said, his name's Vladimir Tendryakov, and he says, we have to do something, we have to give people something, because a sacred space is never empty. And what that usually translates, in Russian it's «Свято место пусто не бывает», but usually the way that's translated in English is nature abhors a vacuum, right? So that's the idea that like it's an unstable emptiness, right? Like something is going to come in, and they say, if it's not us, it's going to be our enemies. So that's the title is from that.
So that's actually, he coined the phrase.
Well, it's an actual proverb. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. So, but he kind of invokes it in that moment to make his point. Yeah.
Well, okay, look, hurry back.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.